Welcome, everyone. My name is Julia Beatty, and I'm the chair of the Shuswap Climate Action Society. We're excited to be presenting the third of this webinar series, Lose the Lawn, Rewilding Your Yard. Before we get started, I want to first acknowledge that we are grateful to be on the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territory of the Secwepemc Nation. So the objective of the Lose the Lawn educational webinars is to provide you with the tools to transition your lawns into a diverse yard that addresses our changing climate, the need to conserve water, the desire to attract wildlife, including pollinators, as well as grow food. Tonight, we are continuing that process and hope you learn more about how these objectives can be achieved. Let me remind you that the recordings of parts 1 and 2 of the series are available on our website. Tonight's presentation is being recorded and we will include it on our website. And our presenter will be providing us with more information resources that we will share on our website. But go and have a look because we've already got some great materials there for you to check out. So without any further delay,
All right.
we're delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Sarah Johnson. Sarah is a Salmon Arm business owner and is working towards her PhD in ecology. Her research is currently focused on pollinator conservation, in particular how bumblebees respond to wildfire in British Columbia. Sarah was the founding president of the Native Bee Society of BC and has over a decade of experience in pollination biology. We're pleased to have Sarah speak about the potential impacts of climate change on native bees, what has been observed so far, and how to assist them by providing the much needed habitat. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Julia. Great. So yeah, my name's Sarah. I am an ecologist by nature, but I spend a lot of my time doing other things these days, including running my late father's manufacturing business in the Salmon Arm Industrial Park. And I am excited to talk to you all today about Plan B for your lawn. And I put together this presentation with some help from the Native Bee Society of BC and acknowledgements to the people who contributed to some of these slides are right there on this first slide. So thanks, Julia, for the land acknowledgement as well. And I would also like to echo that sentiment that I feel extremely grateful to be spending time on the traditional and unceded territories of the Secwepemc peoples. I am honored to be a guest here, and the land around us would definitely look nothing like it does today without the stewardship from the Secwepemc people since time immemorial. I hope that we can, while we learn about bees today, hold some gratitude in our hearts for their stewardship over the land and its relations, and consider Indigenous teachings, including the fact that we are not separate from the environment, and we have an obligation to care for the relationships that we see that are so important all around us. And so, yeah, I am presenting on behalf of the Native Bee Society of BC, of which I was the founding president back in summer 2019. So it will be 5 years old this year, which is pretty crazy. We are a collective of scientists, land managers, artists, and bee enthusiasts. And anybody can join. The only requirement is that you're interested and passionate about learning about native bees and their conservation in the province of British Columbia. So you can check us out. Website, social media, and I'll be plugging some resources and other sorts of things that the Native Bee Society does throughout this presentation. So, what am I going to talk about today? This is a bit of a roadmap. I am going to start off with a little bit about native bees in BC. So British Columbia is actually a pretty special place for native bees in Canada. I'll talk a little bit about why and some basic bee biology. Then I will move into talking a little bit about climate change and how climate change may impact native bees and how, like, what we have seen in terms of impacts already from some research that's been done. And then the last part of the presentation will be a focus on what to do in your own backyard. So you're interested in getting rid of waste of space lawn and replacing it with some more fun wildlife attractants. And so I'll talk a little bit about the sorts of things that are best for native bees that you can do in your yard. And so wild bees are ecosystem engineers. So bees are essential to the biosphere. Most flowering plants that you see, so over 80% of flowering plants will benefit from pollination by animals. So their seeds and seed set will be improved by animal-assisted pollination. And a lot of that is done by insects. And one of the best groups of insects at pollination is bees. And so when we think about all of the things that wild bees are facing today, these top 4 threats would be, I think, the most important: habitat loss, pesticides, diseases, and invasive species. And of course, given that this series is supported by the Shuswap Climate Action Society, we're going to be focusing on climate change today, but you can contribute to alleviating all of these pressures in your own backyard. And so BC is super cool for bees because we have such a huge diversity of habitat types, a whole bunch of different types of biogeoclimatic zones as you go from the northern to the southern edge of the province. The more types of habitats you have, the more diversity of species living in those habitats, and that is the same for bees. And where we are currently, I'm in Salmon Arm, and I suspect that a lot of you are local to the Shuswap. The southern interior is the highest region of bee diversity in Canada. So just in the southern interior, we have about 400 different species of native bees. So if you have heard of the honeybee is not one of them. If you've heard of bumblebees, there are a handful of bumblebee species, but the vast majority of bee species you might not recognize necessarily as being bees. So BC's native bees can come in all colors of the rainbow. So you can see a bunch of different photos. These are, in fact, all bees. And I often get comments from people like, oh, I thought those shiny green things were flies, and there are shiny green flies, of course, but if you look a little bit closer, you might notice in your garden that a lot of the floral visitors are, in fact, different kinds of strange looking bees. And another sometimes surprising fact for people is that the vast majority, so 90%, upwards of 90% of BC's native bees are solitary. So that means that the female bee is solely responsible for provisioning her young, and there is no hive, there are no workers. And so when we think of, like, culturally bees, actually, most bees don't really look like that with the large scale hives. And bumblebees are actually the only truly social native bee that has these different castes, they're called. And bumblebees live in colonies that are annual. So they only live for approximately 1 year. And so this is a cool video that I took when I was working for a conservation organization in Ontario a few years ago. And you can see what it looks like inside a bumblebee nest. And these bigger bees are queens, bunch of little workers, and there might be even males walking around in there too. So there you go. And BC's native bees also nest in cavities and in the ground. And so most native bees can be split into two different categories of nesting types, and that can be referred to as renters versus excavators. So certain native bees, the renters, are looking for cavities that are already established to build nests in, and excavators are a little bit more industrious. They might dig their own nest or open up cavities in different sorts of materials to create their own nests. And approximately 30% of our native bees will nest in woody tunnels. So things like stems or twigs or snags, or potentially even in abandoned beetle burrows. And the rest of the 70% typically nest in the ground. So in bare or partially vegetated, well-drained soil, because you can imagine bees aren't necessarily that great at swimming. So they want to make sure that their nests are dry, well-drained is typically where they will be looking to create nests. And so a little bit of an introduction to a typical bee life cycle with a focus first on solitary bees, since the vast majority of our bees are solitary. Typically, solitary bees live for about a total of 1 year. And most people, if you had to guess, because when you think bees, you probably think of what the adults look like here. So that's usually what we think of when we think of a bee. But bees actually exist as different looking organisms for the majority of their life. And so a bee will start off as an egg, it will hatch into a larvae, grow into a larger larvae, pupate, and exist as a pupae. And then the adult life stage is actually only a smaller component of that larger life cycle. And so the adult is actually typically only alive for between 3 to 6 weeks. So of that whole year that a solitary bee might exist, only about 3 to 6 weeks of its life does it actually look like what we typically think of when we think of a bee. And so, crazily enough, most native bees never meet their young. And so, adult female solitary bees are focused on provisioning pollen and nectar for their offspring. So you can see here in this example life cycle, there's a little egg here, and the mother bee gathers pollen ball, typically pollen mixed together with nectar. Once the egg hatches, the larvae consume this and then pupate. But in these stages, mom is usually long gone because remember, she only lives for 3 to 6 weeks and she is very busy during that time collecting all of the food to be able to provision her young later on. And this is a bumblebee life cycle. So I am a bumblebee specialist, so can't get away without talking about the bumblebee life cycle as well, though, as I mentioned, they are the only truly social species. And in BC, we have about 35 different species of bumblebees. So of that 450 to 500 total species of native bees in BC. Bumblebees are a pretty small proportion of them, but they're big and cute. And so probably one of the most noticeable bees that we'll start to see coming out spring just around the corner is the queen bumblebee. So the queens are actually the only bumblebee that survives for an entire year. And the rest of the different casts of bumblebees typically live for a few weeks to a month at the longest. And so queen bumblebees will be emerging soon. When she comes out of hibernation, she's looking for food and a place to nest. So bumblebees are typically renters. They're looking for abandoned cavities, often abandoned rodent burrows. She'll be on her own into the early summer. She's responsible for starting to lay eggs, collecting nectar, and provisioning her young with pollen in these egg cells as well. At some point later on, when her first brood of workers emerges, the workers take over doing most of the work. Queen's job becomes just laying eggs inside the colony. Later on, she'll switch from laying eggs that create workers to laying eggs that hatch into new queens and males. Those new queens and males will emerge from the colony, mate with other queens and males, and then everyone except the mated queens, the newly mated queens, dies at the end of the season. And so these mated queens, they store the sperm internally, find some place to overwinter somewhere, and emerge to start the cycle again the next spring. And so what happens when we are dealing with the impacts of climate change? And I'm sure all of you have noticed that we are certainly already dealing with a lot of these impacts. So we're seeing changing precipitations and temperature patterns. And I think often what's most difficult for most organisms, including ourselves, from climate change, from what we've seen so far, is that things become a lot more extreme and unpredictable. And so for bees, the same sort of thing. It becomes really difficult when you don't really know what's coming and when it might be coming. So things like heat waves, deep freezes, drought, atmospheric rivers. We've all experienced smoke and destructive wildfires. We've also had a number of false springs this year, followed by freezing temperatures and more snow. And so, especially during certain points in, for example, different seasons or for certain points when certain bee species are particularly vulnerable, when these weather patterns start to swing wildly in this unpredictable way, it's that much harder for all of us to be able to react appropriately based on our past or historical expectations of how we think things will go seasonally. And so as climate change changes a lot of these weather patterns and can change landscapes through changing temperatures, precipitation, and extreme weather events, all of us have to figure out how to deal with this unpredictability. And so how are bees impacted by climate change? And so some people can be frustrated with this, but as an ecologist, I am used to responding to almost every question with "it depends," or sometimes it can be unpredictable. But to think about what might happen, we can kind of simplify things and think about what are the main things that bees require. And the two main things would be similar to us: food and shelter. And so food is typically flowers for bees, and shelter includes places to nest and also places to overwinter. Sometimes those are the same things, depending on the species of bee. But the what, the when, and the where of both the food and the shelter can change with climate change. And so different species might be vulnerable at different points in their life cycle or during different seasons. So, for example, I don't know about everyone else, but I feel particularly vulnerable during the winter. There's not a lot of light, it's very cold, and that can also be a very difficult season for bees to make it through. If you think about the different life stages of bees, so with both solitary bees and with bumblebees, different life stages can be more or less vulnerable. So, for example, if you're a pupae and you can't move, you can't necessarily do anything behaviorally to escape things that are happening because of climate change. And so that may be a life stage that is particularly vulnerable for certain species. And for bumblebees, queens, especially when they're on their own, for example, during overwintering, can be very vulnerable. If the queen's gone, that eliminates the hope for the whole colony because she is responsible for all of the reproduction of the colony. And to make matters worse, queens are actually more sensitive to heat than a lot of, so both workers and males and bumblebees. So queens may have a lower heat tolerance to extreme heat. And so if queens are impacted by climate change, obviously we have a problem. And depending on the impacts of climate change, different species can feel the changes differently. So changes in temperature might impact different species differently, changes in precipitation, changes in snowpack. And so what might happen if we didn't do anything and we let climate change proceed and we see what happens to all of the different bee species? And it's not necessarily that all bees are doomed and every single one of them will respond negatively to these changes because of climate. A lot of the research that has been done to date has shown that for not only just bees, but all sorts of groups of different species, we typically have both winners and losers. And so depending on the different traits of the different bees, you might see different sorts of susceptibility to the different sorts of changes from climate change, like I just mentioned on the last slide. And so, for example, I can rattle off a bunch of different potential expectations that we might have. There was a pretty large-scale long-term study coming out of a research station in Colorado on native bees, so pretty nearby. And they found that, of course, different bees are reacting to different changes differently. So, for example, bee species that are comb building and larger bodied, they saw typically tended to decline with increasing temperatures, but smaller bees that nested directly in the soil typically increased with increasing temperatures. And bees that are more specialized in their diet, so they may only visit a few certain species of flowers. Actually, they saw an increase in relative abundance of those types of bees with decreased rainfall. Reduced snowpack led to a reduced relative abundance of bees that overwintered as pre-pupae, so the stage right before they pupate, whereas bees that overwintered as adults actually increased with reduced snowpack. And so all of that's to say is that we are not necessarily going to see a vast destruction of bees, but with the potential changes in communities because of some winners and some losers, we can end up with a lot of the relationships that we have seen that have been developed over many, many, many years of evolution can be disrupted as we're losing certain species that are more vulnerable to these changes. So, so something that has been observed to happen in a variety of different species, as well as certain bee species, is if you look at, for example, two different locations, they may not necessarily be declining in species richness, so like the number of bee species that are located there. But if you look at this location and this location, they might look very similar. So those species that are winning might be winning everywhere. And so the more technical term for this is called biotic homogenization. So we may not necessarily see that we're losing a lot of diversity at the local scale, but at regional scales, we might just be ending up with all of the same species everywhere. And we don't necessarily know the long-term consequences of those sorts of changes. And so what can we do to help our native bees and pollinators in our yards? And so I always have to say that the number one thing that you can do to protect species of any kind, not just native pollinators, is protecting, preserving, and managing habitat for wild populations of plants and bees. So we're all competing for space in the landscape, and preserving and protecting as much natural spaces as we can to maintain these reservoirs of native species is always super important. But we all, well, I assume everybody who is attending this talk is potentially interested in what you can do in your own yard and the sorts of ways that you might be able to contribute besides protecting things like parks and other areas. And so this is a really cool diagram drawing that I found that kind of touches on a lot of different things that can be important when you're thinking about designing your yard to support pollinators. So native species of plants are always the best, and they're the best for a wide variety of reasons. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that a little bit later. Big patches of each plant species are ideal for all different sorts of bees, because bees are kind of just little energy balancers. And so they're doing their best to get as much energy as possible while expending as little energy as possible. And so if you have a lot of flowers of the same kind in one area, bees will be super happy because they won't have to expend as much energy looking for different flower patches. They can visit a bunch of them in one area, fill their honey stomachs, and be able to provide for their young. So big patches. Be patient is a big thing. So developing a yard that supports native species takes time. It's not necessarily that you're going to tomorrow have a beautiful reservoir for all sorts of species. Be chemical free, so obviously avoid pesticides and herbicides and fungicides as much as possible. So all of these chemicals, even if they aren't targeting specific bee species, have been found in a lot of different studies, can have different sorts of indirect and potentially sublethal effects on bees and other insects. And so try to be as careful and as organic as possible. Be a little messy. I love this personally because I never feel like I have enough time for gardening. And so leave the mess, leave things as long as possible. Natural nature is messy. And so the messier your yard, the more attractive it is to native species. And yeah, all sorts of different tips on this beautiful drawing. And so if we're thinking about providing shelter, food and shelter for bees in our yard, what is suitable shelter for bees? And we thought about the different life cycles, renters versus excavators, above ground and below ground. You can provide all sorts of different nesting materials for native bees in your yard. And so bees that typically live in colonies, like bumblebees, are looking for larger cavities. So old rodent burrows, though sometimes they'll nest on the surface in dead vegetation or thatched ground. And bees will often attempt to occupy your bird boxes. And I have also put up a number of bumblebee nest boxes. And if you're lucky, a bumblebee queen may decide to select your nest box. And things like trees, shrubs, logs, grasses, different sorts of plants with hollow, pithy stems, areas with mud, leaves, and different types of plants can produce resin, all that different bee species might use for nesting. And then species that nest underground, given that we're trying to get rid of lawns, if your lawn is looking pretty sad already, that is a great thing for native bees. So these kind of bald spots in lawns are often really great for ground nesting bees. Bare ground, sandy, so different types of often, so not only can bees sometimes specialize on the types of food that they eat, but they also might specialize on the types of nesting material that they might use, including the different soil types. And so if you have a variety of different exposed soil in your yard, you may see a variety of different ground nesting bees start to move in and use it for nesting. And I included this video too, given that we're thinking about climate change, and part of climate change can be more extreme heat waves in the summer. And so this is a video that I took from a bumblebee nest box that was strapped to a tree on the southern facing side. And this was a very particularly hot day. And you can see these workers trading off duty at the front, this entrance, and they're buzzing their wings as little fans to circulate air through the colony to try and prevent the wax from melting at peak heat in the summer. And so selecting places for putting out nesting material that are more shielded from direct heat in the summer can be helpful to try and help bees beat the heat during these extreme heat waves that we're starting to get more and more of. And so nature provides shelter for bees in many forms, and you can also provide all of these things in your yard. So undisturbed native bunch grasses are often, when they die, are used for different nesting material for a lot of different bee species. Mulch can also be used as nesting material. We talked about well-drained bare ground, dead snag trees, good for nesting birds, also good for cavity nesting bees, dead wood, brush piles, similar sorts of things. Just thinking about creating different sorts of cavities that might be interesting for bees to use for nesting and overwintering. And then plants with these hollow, pithy centers. So plants like sunflowers, raspberries, roses, blackberries, elderberry, snowberry, all these sorts of different shrubs have these hollow, pithy stems that a lot of different bee species can hollow out and lay their eggs to nest in. We're getting into spring now, but like I said, if you can leave things in your yard laying around that can possibly act as shelter, either nesting shelter or overwintering shelter for bees, can be super helpful, especially when we think about how climate change is impacting native species, where these extreme events that they might have to find places to hide from in the shade, for example, or with early spring, and then having to find places to hide back. And when we get these cold snaps after they may have already emerged, leaves in your yard and logs and dead vegetation all can be really useful as shelter for those inclement conditions. And so if we're thinking about bee-friendly yard maintenance, if you can try the rule of thirds. So every year, if you can divide your yard into thirds, if you're doing maintenance, active maintenance on about a third of it, and leaving 2/3 for nesting and overwintering insects, you're doing a pretty good job, and you can rotate where those areas are located each year. And so since spring is coming up around the corner, often it is the time for pruning. And if you're wanting to support different species of solitary bees, especially the ones that use these pithy stems, you might want to start pruning your plants strategically to try and create more nesting sites. And so prioritizing those types of plants, if you can, leave 4 to 6 inches from the stem or the branch nodes, and cutting between 6 inches and a foot above the ground to leave these sorts of stalks. They look very enticing for all sorts of different solitary bee species. And again, shabby patches of lawn, excellent. So if you're leaving parts of your lawn to die, especially if we run into similar sorts of water restriction cases like we did last year, these can be really great for ground nesting bees. And if you start looking a little bit closer, you can observe a lot of cool bee behavior and activity in your yard. For example, Calides is a genus of solitary bees. They're nicknamed the polyester bees because they actually line the cells of their underground nest with a secretion that they make themselves internally that mimics cellophane. And these bees are so cool and cute too. An identifying feature of the Calides group of bees is this very precious heart-shaped face. So if you can get close enough on your hands and knees on your dead patches of lawn to try and check out what sorts of insects might be living there, you might see some heart-shaped face bees if you're lucky. And so with checking off a lot of those things for shelter, we want to try to provide different sources of food for bees as well. And it says simple, but not always so simple. The ideas are simple, where we want to provide as many different species of plants that we can, so that we have blooms through all of the active season of these different bee species. And native plants are always the best and ideal because the native bees have long-standing relationships with native plants. The native plants are going to be providing the right types of nutrition in their pollen and nectar so that the native bees feeding off of them are healthy and successful. And when we're thinking about the different bee species that are most at risk to challenges like climate change, we're typically thinking of the specialists. So the bees that can only eat from a few select species or one genera of plant. And bees like bumblebees, for example, can learn how to access all sorts of different plants, and all sorts of different plants can provide them with appropriate nutrition to be able to raise their bee babies. And so if we try to focus on providing the plants that specialists need, the generalists will also be able to use that variety of plants in the same way. And when we're thinking about native plants, most native plants, of course, are more naturally drought tolerant than a lot of garden plants or cultivars. So they might not look as pretty and enticing and have these great displays that last all season long because they haven't been bred for that necessarily. And so when you are out shopping for plants, native plants might not be the ones that most attract your eye if you don't see them during the specific period where they're typically going to be flowering. But that does not mean that they don't deserve a place in your yard. And so when we're thinking about different species of native plants that we might try to target to support native species, putting native species into gardens, into green spaces can help connect different areas that are more natural or quote unquote undeveloped. And so this can provide connectivity between wild populations of bees. And so I am going to flip through some great species of native plants that support a wide variety of different native bee species. And one thing that is actually pretty cool with the way that specialization works in bees often is that specialized bees, so bees that only forage on a select few species or one or two genera of plants, often the specialization is asymmetric. And so one species or set of species of plants might support a wide variety of specialist bees. It's not necessarily just one-to-one. And so, for example, if you plant Phacelia species, you'll be supporting this beautiful, unique native bee. Duphoria trochanthera is a species that we have in the interior, but you also might be supporting a lot of different other specialist bees at the same time. So a really good example of this that we have in BC, and we have different species on the coast and in the interior, but gumweed, so Grindelia scorosa is the interior species, curly-cupped gumweed, supports about 16 different specialist bees. So by planting this one species of plant in your yard, you might attract up to 16 of these more vulnerable types of bees, one of which is the variable Carter bee, which is pictured here. Super cool. This bee creates nests of pebbles that it cements together with a sticky resin. And so if you plant some curly cup gumweed, you might attract this beautiful species of native bee. And like I mentioned, probably before a few of you arrived, but native willow species are some of the first species of flowers to start blooming in early spring. Right about now, we're starting to see the crazy, weird, fluffy looking flowers start to pop. And there are a wide variety of native willow species. And native willows support, again, a wide variety of specialist native bees. So these are two examples of different specialist mining bees that require native willow pollen to be able to support their offspring. And we have 14 different specialist bees that depend on native willows in the interior of BC. So pussy willows, there are a wide variety of other types of native willows as well. Super great for specialist native bees. And so speaking of these pollen specialists, if you navigate to the Native Bee Society of BC website under forage resources, you can access this really cool resource that lists the top 10 plant species that you can plant in your yard that will support these specialist pollen bees in the interior of BC. And so feel free to navigate to that free download. But what might be running through your head as you think about planning your garden for the spring is, where do I typically get all of the plants and seeds that I plant in my garden? And have I noticed that those places you can buy native species of plants, and in your average nursery, the vast majority of species of plants that you'll be able to access and buy are not going to be native species. And unfortunately, a lot of mainstream nurseries might stock plants that look like they might be native, but they might actually be what's called, or what's often referred to as, nativars. So like native species that have been bred over generations for certain traits that are still attractive to gardeners, so that they're looking attractive and full of blooms when people are shopping for flowers. But if you can, like I said, native is best. But I have emphasized here, perfection is the enemy of progress, and it's not always easy to source these native species of plants locally. So ideally, you want to be shopping for native plants within approximately 100 kilometers of where you're planting them. But these two native plant nurseries, both located in Kelowna, provide some great species. So if you're visiting the city, pretty close, almost within the 100 kilometers, and they are often adapted to similar sorts of conditions that we might have in the Shuswap. So you are able to plant native plants from these particular nurseries here. I am also working with a local farm in Notch Hill to try to develop more native plant propagation and potentially supply native plants on a more local level. But like I mentioned, developing these sorts of things takes time. So if you're interested in trying to plant native plants in your yard, you can investigate similar sorts of things that we are working on, trying to propagate these plants. And so learning identification of native plants using field guides, local field guides, to look at different sorts of native wildflowers and how to identify different species. You can collect seeds sustainably if you know the species and observe that the species is living in similar conditions that you might see in your yard. And so when we say sustainably, we try to think about rules of thumb for harvesting anything from the wild. And so if you're gathering seeds, only gather seeds that you are going to be planting. A good rule of thumb is to taking at most 10% of seeds in a group of plants in one area. So if you're picking from seed pods, usually one or two from each of a number of different pods, and only collect from larger populations. So if you only see a handful of plants in an area, try to avoid collecting seeds from that area, because you might have more of an impact on the native environment. And experiment. Try out some seeds in different areas of your lawn, see what happens. And you have to be patient, because with native plants as well, often it may take several years before you even start to get blooms from these seeds that you've planted. And there are a lot of resources out there as well. So sitting right beside me is a really great book that is actually written for our specific region. It's called Cultivating the Wild by Eva Durrance and Gardening with Native Plants of British Columbia's Southern Interior and Eastern Washington. And so this is a really great resource with tips on the sorts of things that you should consider when trying to think about native plants in your yard, and lists a bunch of different native plant species to this area and the different sorts of ways that you would need to collect seeds from them and care for them to have them in your own yard. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that do not go and dig up, see a bunch of native plants and be like, ooh, those would look better in my yard than in this natural wild place that they exist already. So if you're a gardener already, you know that transplant shock is a thing. And so removing any plant from a place that it's already growing is a risk to that plant. It may not survive the transplant. And when plants are living in the wild, they're probably living in the best place possible for them. And so you don't want to remove plants from an ecosystem to move them into your yard where they might not do as well. So no poaching, sustainable seed collection only is my firm recommendation. And the Native Bee Society also just finished creating this really great resource, Plants for BC Bees, and specifically for gardeners in the Southern Interior. And so this is a resource that you can access by heading to the Native Bee Society website, Native Plants for BC Bees, and ours is the Southern Interior. There's also one for coastal BC. And this is a list of a bunch of different plant species that are commonly visited by all sorts of native bees and are easy to grow in your garden. And so this includes, there's, I think, one species of tree, a number of shrub species, and then a number of forb species as well. So this is a really great start for you to start thinking about species that might fit well in your yard that you might be able to collect seeds for or potentially purchase from some of the nearby native plant nurseries. And so this is my last slide with a bit more of a plug for the Bee Society. So if you're interested in learning more about native bees, check out our website. There's tons of online and in-person events. Most of the ones around here are led by me, but there's this really cool native bee study group online the fourth Wednesday of each month. I believe there is one next week on spring bees. So you can learn more about bees in this online study group. There's a really cool online iNaturalist project. So if any of you have heard of iNaturalist, it's a citizen science project where you can log in, submit photos of anything, not just bees, not just plants. And there is quite a large community of different biologists and taxonomists that will go on and tell you what species the thing that you have observed is. And the Native Bee Society has specifically a bee tracker project. So if you have taken any pictures of bees anywhere, go and submit them, and you will be part of a growing iNaturalist community. And yeah, there's also this really cool program that is just getting off the ground. And so I suspect that some of you may be familiar with and may even be master gardeners yourself, but the Native Bee Society is part of a program called the Master Melittologist program. And a melittologist is a scientist of native bees. And so similar sort of thing where you're learning about the diversity of native bees in BC. And there is a very cool field course in Penticton every year that that you can go to and learn how to catch and identify all sorts of very cool native bee species. So check out the website. My email is also here if you are interested in native bee presentations, learning more about bees, different sorts of educational programs. Feel free to reach out to me directly. And I have gone a little bit over time, but I think we should have time for questions if anyone has any. So thanks so much for listening.
Great, Sarah. Terrific presentation. We really appreciate all of your expertise and knowledge here. I should say, first of all, Sarah and I will sit down and we'll put some of these resources on our website. And so if you're on our website, we have a page dedicated to Lose the Lawn, and we'll add all this information that we can and links to various resources. Any questions? Come on, you guys. It was pretty thorough, so maybe there won't be any questions. Okay, before people go, if there's no questions, that's great. You did a terrific job, Sarah. Before I sign off, though, I just want to remind people that we're going to have a fourth session online in the series, the Lose the Lawn series, and it'll be Tuesday, April the 2nd at 7 o'clock. This time, we're going to have a guest speaker. Her name is Michaela Cannon. She's from Armstrong. Some of you may know her. And she's going to focus on creating a wild edible yard, including plants that you might not have thought were edible, not just dandelions. So anyway, the registration link is on our website. Please go there and register for that. And yes, we will be putting the recording. We'll put a link to it on social media, and there will be a link on our website as well. So if you go to www.shuswapclimate.org, you can find all the links there. So terrific, great evening. And I just want to thank everyone for all of your attention tonight, and hopefully we'll see you next time.